Last Airbender is quite possibly the most confusingly inept film I've ever seen. An adaptation of the Nickelodeon television series Avatar: The Last Airbender, written, directed, and produced by M. Night Shyamalan, it's not the worst morally or technically, but it still baffles me just how bad the final product is once all the factors are taken into consideration. This is going to be a lazy episode. We're not even really going to talk about it. We're just going to bitch and whine. In fact, we're going to be super lazy about it too. Forget the normal flow. This is now a top X list of whatever. You know what? I'm not even going to go back and change that once I know what the number actually is. I've got a whole bunch of points to bring up, but the first thing that you're going to notice is that there's no one thing wrong with this movie. Everything is wrong with it. There's no one element of the production that doesn't have some kind of deep, crippling flaw, and these flaws multiply each other. Bad acting makes a bad script worse, bad editing calls attention to bad acting, bad cinematography makes bad editing all the more unbearable. Even the parts that, strictly speaking, aren't incompetent are pulled down by everything else. Solid animation and effects work looks terrible when it's combined with clunky choreography or is just really poorly stitched together. No matter how realistic your fake lemur looks, the effect is going to look like crap if the actor is clearly waving their hands at empty space, looking at nothing in particular.
There must be thousands of them on this mountain.
I'm not going to spend a ton of time harping on this, but the movie makes a lot of really dumb, pointless changes to the source material. This is my lump category for all the little nitpicks like character names, motivations, little details, and other crap. A lot of other people have covered these exhaustively, they bug me too, but I want to focus on deeper structural flaws, so just consider this a catch-all. If I missed something, put it here. First off, I realize that there's going to be certain challenges with the script for this film because condensing 500 minutes of television down to a 100-minute movie isn't going to be all that easy. That said, it shouldn't turn out this bad. The overall pace and flow of the movie is atrocious. I've tried to narrow it down to a few specifics, but the best way to put it is that it lacks focus. The script doesn't seem to understand what its core story is, who the characters are, what drives them, and what it should do with them. The result is a movie that feels like it's moving way too fast, jumping from scene to scene at a moment's notice, but never seems to actually go anywhere. Characters don't so much transition from place to place as much as they just walk off stage. There's a practical epidemic of expositional problems as a result. Secondary characters prattle on about meaningless mythology and wax philosophic while we still don't even know who the main characters are. Hell, the main characters seem to spend most of their time talking, filling in random backstory or talking about pointless details. Like this whole bit at the beginning, Katara, who is, in theory, the narrator of the film and co-star, despite a dearth of presence, tells us a bunch of stuff about the Southern Water Tribe, how it used to be a big city, her father, her mother, the war, how hungry they are, and for some reason how her brother isn't a very good hunter.
My brother and I often go hunting for food, but unfortunately my brother isn't the best hunter in the world.
Aside from the fact that there's a war going on, none of this matters. Some of it will be mentioned again, but it doesn't make a difference. The fact that Sokka and Katara have been forced into adulthood at a young age doesn't influence their characters at all. In fact, neither of them really has anything that could be called a character arc. Even though I've watched it 4 times now, I'm still hard-pressed to identify what motivates these characters. Like, normally, this little exchange about tracking the seal would be a setup for later on. Like in the 3rd act, Sokka has to prove himself by following someone's tracks, or he has to, I don't know, hunt something. But no, it never comes up again. Like I said before, all of these little bits and pieces intertwine with one another. The script is bad, but it's aggravated by some truly poor editing. This runs the entire gamut, including odd shot choices, weird cut points, and nonsensical juxtapositions. The first act of the movie is an unholy mess. It's nonsense, gibberish. It's worse than amateur. It's missing all the connective tissue that ties the story, character, and various pieces together. There's so many little wrong moments that I'm having trouble picking out which ones to mention because they start to run into each other. Okay, so Katara and Sokka bust Aang out of this ice bubble, right? You'd assume that this is where the characters will introduce each other and will set up the fundamental dynamic between the three protagonists, right? Like, there will be some wacky hijinks, and we'll learn that Aang is a fun-loving and curious goofball with mad airbending skills, that Sokka is a big softie who plays tough because he feels obligated to fill the void left by his father, and that Katara is smart, sensitive, fiercely loyal to her friends, and protective of the weak and downtrodden. But what actually happens is, well, nothing, really. I mean, they find him, Katara pokes Aang a couple of times, decides that he needs a nap, there's a gag where Appa's tail lands on Sokka, and then we're suddenly back in town. There's no transition between locations and no exchange between characters. You'd think that bringing a comatose stranger and a 4-ton, 6-legged bison into town would draw some attention and questions. You'd think that it'd be the kind of significant moment that would be perfect for establishing the setting and characters as we, the audience, see how Katara and Sokka handle the problem and how they try to explain it to the people back home. Instead, no information is exchanged. The audience learns nothing, and they apparently teleport back to home base. Oh, okay, actually, that's not entirely true. There is an establishing shot, but blink and you'll miss it. These two nameless characters point at something off screen. I guess that's them being all amazed at this crazy thing that's happening over there, to the right, somewhere, off that way. Wow. Look at that crazy thing. So crazy. Okay, so in the igloo, Katara and Aang have a boring and inane conversation where they open their word holes and make noises at one another, but manage to say nothing of any consequence.
Oh, I see.
Actually, Katara's response makes sense if you read it like someone trying to be polite when confronted with unintelligible madness. See, the fact that Appa can fly hasn't been established yet, so when she asks,
"How'd you get all the way out here?"
it's a pretty legit question about how a boy and a mastodon managed to get out into the middle of nowhere, become entombed in ice, and survive for an indeterminate period of time. Because, you see, this is a very confusing situation. So when he says,
I ran away from home.
as though that more or less covers all the bases, her utterly confused response of,
Oh, I see.
is actually a pretty believable reaction. I mean, no one wants to call Ice Cube Boy a liar on his first day in town. It's still bad writing, though. I know it's going back to the bad script, but there's this running trend where characters will talk at length about meaningless bullcrap and then completely gloss over important information. Plus, he has yet to introduce himself. Technically speaking, we, the audience, don't even know his name, and neither does Katara. In fact, we don't learn it for another 10, 13 minutes.
Is it okay if you tell me your name?
The monks named me Ang.
This scene also introduces two more running problems that we'll see through the film: poorly matched shot-reverse shot framing, and a hanging action. Shot-reverse shot is a common setup for editing dialogue. In fact, it's so common that it's considered a basic technique. At the fundamental level, the shot and the reverse shot will be fairly closely matched. Without getting too technical or meaty, let's just say that for a neutral conversation between two characters, their heads should be roughly the same size on screen. Also, for the sake of interest, to create some ebb and flow, the edit should mix in a variety of different framings, some tighter and some looser. This is all part of the visual language of film. Close-ups on an actor's face feel more intense than looser shots, and by moving in and out through a scene, the filmmakers can communicate how important this bit of information is relative to that bit of information. What we get here is a shot-reverse shot where Aang is this big and Katara is this big, with zero variation. It's the same two shots through the entire dialogue. Also, for no real reason, her framing is all wobbly, like it's handheld, while his is locked off. This isn't even the worst case of it. That comes later at the end of Act 1, where Sokka and Katara are shot like this, and Aang is shot like this, through the entire conversation. God, why is it so close to his face? Wait, let's go back to the igloo. A hanging action. Okay. Throughout the film, characters will start an action as though the scene is going to continue, but then the movie cuts away to something completely different before they actually do or say whatever it was that they started doing. So Aang and Katara have their pointless conversation, it ends, and then Aang reaches over for this stick and looks at her like he's about to say something. Clearly, reaching for this thing was important, because the edit waited a whole beat for him to even start the action. He stops talking, beat, reaches for the stick, cut to the Fire Nation ship. This actually bleeds right into another example of a lack of connective tissue. Devoid of any shot that places the ship in relation to the village, Sokka walks into the igloo and says, "The Fire Nation is here." We don't see him seeing the ship, we don't see the ship in the background, beaching just outside the village, we just see the ship out in the water, the same place it's been the whole time. It's bad editing because it fails to place important set pieces into a spatial relationship. This crap goes on and on and on. We spend a lot of time going into slow-mo for the fight scenes, but almost no time indicating the connection between point A and point B. Like this whole mess where Katara in a voiceover sums up Aang's backstory by telling us that he told her that he flew into a storm and fell into the water and formed an air bubble and doesn't remember anything else after that. It's like a Matryoshka doll of bad narrative. I mean, for one, shouldn't we have learnt all that earlier, like during a scene where they were already explicitly talking about the subject of where he came from? And two, the whole thing is made unbearably stupid by this line.
Is it okay if you tell me your name?
So, they flew from the Antarctic up to this temperate, possibly subtropical mountain range, during which time he told them all about how he came to get trapped in the ice, and at no point during that trip did they bother to ask him his name. All this after they've decided to join him on his mystical journey of unknown duration and scope. God only knows if they ever got around to telling him theirs, since we never actually see that interaction. I mean, I'm not going to demand realism for my fantasy films, like I don't need the world of Avatar to be properly scaled to Earth to the point where this trip takes several days, if not weeks, but I still think it's going to take more than, 10-15 minutes to make this journey. Also, this whole bit, Aang getting trapped in the ice, is kind of the sort of thing that you should probably show the audience instead of just telling them about it.
Told us how he left there in a storm on Appa and got forced into the ocean where they almost drowned.
And to make this even more inept, okay, so they've actively dodged around Aang's name twice up to this point. First when they find him, and second when Zuko takes him captive.
I don't need to tell you anything.
He's the titular character. They're withholding the information. Clearly it's building up to some meaningful reveal, right? Nope. Not only does the reveal have zero impact on Katara or Sokka, meaning that it doesn't mean anything to them, but he just shouts it back at them from off screen.
The monks named me Aang.
I don't even know. Did they forget to shoot a reverse shot? Did they have this line in the script and at no point think, gee, the title character should probably be on screen when he finally introduces himself? Wow. Okay. Oh, and then we roll from this monstrosity of poor pacing right into another example of both poor pacing, bad editing, terrible information flow, and a hard tone shift. Really, most of the information that they exchange here at the temple should have been brought out like 10-15 minutes earlier back at the South Pole. You know, maybe have the main characters talk and build some rapport with one another before heading off on their grand adventure, keeping in mind that based on all the information we've been given, Sokka and Katara make their decision after Katara alone has had a microscopic conversation with Aang. Seriously, back in the igloo they only had like 8 lines of dialogue, but here they are at the air temple, and just now is Katara bothering to ask any questions in an attempt at piecing together Aang's very obviously hole-filled story. There's some terrible interaction with a CG lemur, and then, BAM! The killing fields of Cambodia. This should be a suspenseful moment leading up to the reveal, but it's not because 1, it happens too fast, and 2, we have no reason to care. We've barely been introduced to Aang, and our surrogate characters have only just pieced together that there's some bad juju waiting up ahead. Even better, the movie gets around to telling us why we should care after it's too late for us to care. Oh, and after this scene, they just teleport again. There's the whole freak out moment, we cut away to the Fire Nation stuff, and when we come back to our protagonists, they've traveled an indeterminate distance to an unknown place, apparently instantaneously. This is a running flaw, but it's made worse by the fact that they actually get it right sometimes. See, when they leave the South Pole, there's a short travel montage as they fly to the Air Temple, and we see them arrive at the Air Temple. This is important because it's connective tissue. It tells us, the audience, that time is passing and space is being covered. This is pretty basic editing. It doesn't need to eat up a lot of time, but it's critical to properly communicating the temporal spatial elements of the story, which is pretty important in this case. I mean, It's quite literally a hero's journey from the South Pole to the North Pole. What they've built is a road trip story where the characters are never in the car. Our main characters don't really interact with one another. Sure they do stuff together, sort of, but for the most part they just talk at one another and do things in proximity. All of the interesting stuff, like chatter, playing, arguing, plotting, confiding, and celebrating, happens off-screen, and we're just told about it after the fact, often in voiceover.
My brother and the princess became friends right away.
Really? Because that sounds like it would have been fun to see. We could have watched them share some witty banter, flirt a bit, go on a date of sorts, and do something other than glance furtively at one another. Also, let's talk about our main character for a second, particularly his little freak-out moment. So he's walking through the bones and sees the medallion he made for his old master. Then he flips his lid, goes all Super Saiyan. We're supposed to care about this moment, get invested in his loss. It's, in theory, setting up Aang's character arc, but in practice, Aang has only had about 20 lines of dialogue up to this point, total, almost all of which has been expository in the weakest way possible. It's almost impossible to care about Aang at this point because he's a one-way street. He rattles off whatever's on the top of his mind, but doesn't seem to care if anyone's actually listening, or if they understand him, or if they even care. He doesn't even ask their names. This doesn't get any better as the movie goes on. Aang rarely actually interacts with other characters in any meaningful way, and doesn't really seem to notice that they're even in the same room as him.
He's kind of like my father.
While that kind of egocentrism makes for a very believable 10-year-old, it's not a very engaging trait for a protagonist. The dialogue is just atrocious, and the deliveries make it all the worse. Here's some of my favorite worst exchanges.
He's exhausted.
Hey, Shinzo! Monet! I'm back! Hey, guys!
Is it okay if you tell me your name?
She's a bender.
I ran away, but I'm back now.
The Avatar would have to be an airbender. Are you an airbender, boy?
How is he doing that? Should we try it?
Yes, we should. This was their practice area.
My brother and the princess became friends right away.
Again, I offer my condolences on your nephew burning to death in that terrible accident.
Is there a spiritual place where I can meditate?
There is a very spiritual place. The city was built around this place.
As your brother Fire Lord Ozai and I have decided it is in our best interests to kill the moon spirit.
We could be friends, you know.
He's making fire out of nothing.
I believe that my life force will leave my body and return to the moon spirit.
And then what?
My soul will no longer exist in this form.
They want you to be their avatar.
We're going to play the blame game, and the person to blame is Shyamalan. Hey, Foldy? Yes, fictional viewer being used as a rhetorical device? Isn't that a little harsh? Movies are a collaborative effort. How can you say something is entirely one person's fault? Well, okay, I'll pull my punch a bit. I wasn't there, so I can't say for sure that Shyamalan pulled rank or whatever and wound up pissing in the stew pot, but let's take a moment to look at all the department heads and see if we can identify a weak link. Seriously, he's the most likely problem. I spent a lot of time bitching about the editing, so I guess we should take a look at the editor. Conrad Buff probably isn't someone who's ever caught your attention, and frankly, his editing isn't anything, I don't know, exceptional? Like, he's hardly the kind of editor that you'd think of as an artist elevating the craft of editing by weaving complex visual tales, but at the same time, it's very likely that you're familiar with his work. In fact, his work basically defines the typical Hollywood style if you're thinking of straightforward, no-frills, competent, high-quality, mainstream, invisible editing. What's on his resume? Only a couple dozen big-budget mainstream effects-driven films, including Species, Terminator 2, Titanic, True Lies, Dante's Peak, Terminator Salvation, and Rise of the Planet of the Apes. The dude clearly knows what he's doing and can tell an intelligible story with whatever he's given. Alright, so Maybe it's the cinematographer's fault then. Maybe the DOP didn't get enough coverage, didn't bother to shoot a variety of framings, leaving Mr. Buff with nothing to work with. That's a possibility, right? Fat chance. Andrew Lesney is an equally well-seasoned professional and the kind of DOP that I would describe as an artist. You probably know him as the Oscar winner who shot over 6 million feet of film for The Lord of the Rings. Not only is he a longtime veteran of the craft, but he's also incredibly familiar with lighting, blocking, and framing incredibly complicated scenes, weaving together actors, green screen, and conventional effects, while still getting the coverage needed for the editor to tell a story. We actually have a litmus test for how these two department heads fit together because they have worked together on another project. After Last Airbender, they both worked on Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which is a perfectly competent film. It certainly isn't plagued with hanging actions, lack of coverage, and weird framing choices. Okay, so the key creative decision-making roles in a film are the cinematographer, the editor, the director, the writer, the producer, and sometimes the lead actors. This isn't an actor-driven movie, so we can assume that, by and large, the cast showed up, did their job, and collected their paycheck. We've already eliminated the editor and cinematographer as suspects, so that leaves the director, writer, and producer. Hey, if you want to take all the credit, you get to take all the blame.